Hi there. Welcome to Monuments and Political Speech, the first program that's a part of Commonwealth, a multi-year partnership between three institutions: the Institute for Contemporary Art at VCU in Richmond, the Philadelphia Contemporary, and also Beta Local in San Juan, Puerto Rico. This project explores the historical concept of Commonwealth and its legacy in the three locations. We asked ourselves and our communities, what do we share in common? Who is the we in we the people? And how can we reimagine wealth and come together for the common good? So Commonwealth explores these questions and how our common resources are used to influence the wealth and well-being of our communities. We had originally planned that the exhibition would open in three locations, but following the pandemic, the ICA ended up becoming the only site for the exhibition, which includes newly commissioned work by 9 artists. But we decided to expand the project to include shared online programming like today's event, as well as an online publication, which will launch in 3 installments starting in November. So tonight's panel includes some of the artists included in the exhibition, along with a couple of guests to help us think through some of the questions related to Commonwealth, specifically the ways in which discourse, conversation, or speech becomes an act of commoning, and the ways in which it can be a vehicle for political transformation. So we'll think of questions like, what are the circumstances that allow for speech to become political? How is political speech encouraged or restrained? In recent months, monuments have become sites for civic discourse where we debate the ways in which we want to reform or revolutionize our social structures. Do monuments produce particular kinds of political speech? So our panelists today will include Nelson Rivera, who's an artist included in the exhibition, who's based in San Juan. His work for Commonwealth is a score for a performance that is made up of Puerto Rican activist speeches, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that. Then Sharon Hayes, who's another artist included in the exhibition, who's based in Philadelphia, will be here. Her project is a video installation that consists of interviews with women's tackle football teams who talk about vulnerability, violence, and community. Monica Rodriguez, whose project is about independence monuments in the Caribbean, that is paired together with a quote from a Puerto Rican revolutionary. Paul Farber, who is artistic director and senior curator at the Monument Lab, a public art and history studio, and he'll be talking about monuments as platforms for political discourse. And then Brian Palmer, a Richmond-based journalist, will talk to us about his perspective on the recent discourse around monuments and the Black Lives Matter movement in Richmond over the past summer. So I'll then moderate a conversation with the group following those brief presentations for like around 20 minutes or so. And then we'll open up for questions from the audience for around 10, 15 minutes. So the total run of show should be like 1 to 1.5 hours, depending. And then along the way, even from the beginning, feel free to use the chat function to communicate together with the audience about the program, but please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions of me or the rest of the panelists related to their work or their presentations or the general concepts that we're discussing. Because I'm gonna be pulling from that at the very end to moderate the conversation using your questions as the basis for it. So first of all, I want to welcome all of our panelists, and first starting with Nelson Rivera.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Nelson Rivera. I'm here in San Juan, Puerto Rico. My piece in the show is a sound performance piece. The materials for that piece come from speeches given by Pedro Albizu Campos between the years 1948 and 50. Speeches dealing with the struggle for Puerto Rican independence and the denunciation of the United States imperialism in Puerto Rico. Those speeches were published in 1993. They were in the police files. And I was struck by two things about those speeches. First one, they were very contemporary. The things that he said in 70 years ago still stand. The lack of political power for Puerto Ricans, the lack of proper economy, of our own economy, the use of public education to erase and even disappear a culture, a history. The poverty that results from colonialism, and the results are hunger, bad health, all those things that make people disappear, whole people disappear. And the other thing that struck me about it was also that he was sent to jail for saying those things. For a country that we're always taught that we have freedom of speech, but being sent to jail for saying those things is really quite striking. So I decided to use those speeches as a way of confronting a history that had been hidden from us, that had been disguised, and put it out there, and very loud. Because if that it's a crime to say those things, then we should all commit that crime. For the performance in Richmond, I decided to do a very size specific piece. I took all the every time Albizu mentions United States or the United States president or government, those are the parts of the speeches that I used, and I give them to performers in the United States, all born and raised in the United States and not knowing the Spanish language. The reason being, among other things, that I was thinking about recent developments that we've seen in the news these days. One of them is all this animosity against people who speak Spanish or who speak with a Spanish accent, which I've been hearing about or seeing videos about people screaming at each other, you know, speak English or whatever. And I love accents, and I wanted to use that in the piece to make it more musical. And the other thing is when the Black Lives Matter movement started, I was also noticing that a lot of the discussions went about the idea that you had to confront white privilege, and that Black people were not supposed or were not responsible for educating white people on their privilege. And those two things were really on my mind while I was working on this piece, because I find it's a way of confronting a history that has been denied. Albizu is very contemporary also in the way he talks about how colonialism in Puerto Rico it also stems from the fact that in the United States, Native Americans were also killed and sent to reservations, and the same goes for the Black Americans. So in a sense, my performance intends to build a bridge between all those issues and in a way confront them in a very difficult way, because all the speeches are very hard. And I can imagine that saying them aloud is not easy, and they shouldn't be easy because the situation isn't either. A performance is never complete until it's performed. So right now, that's the most I can say about it. I'm still learning about it. One composes a performance just to find out what will happen. What would happen if that happens? That's what you do when you are dealing with a performance. So we'll see in the coming weeks what happens and how it develops. I believe Sharon Hayes is next.
Thank you, Nelson.
Sure.
I am going to share screen. Does everybody see an image? Thank you, Nelson, and also to my other fellow panelists. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be in conversation with everybody. What you're looking at is a production image from a brand new piece that I made for Commonwealth, and it's an expanded interview with 43 players from 2 women's tackle football teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The 2 teams are the Dallas Elite Mustangs and the Arlington Impact. One of the places I wanted to begin is actually with maybe how some background about how I come to this topic of political speech, which is that in my early 20s, I had a series of experiences that kind of coalesced to 3 what I think of as foundational understandings of myself as a political person. And in that moment, I came out as a lesbian, an artist, and a feminist. And I think of those as descriptions and understandings and identifications and affiliations, but they are also fundamentally enunciations. They're speakings. So if I say, I am an artist, I am a feminist, I am a lesbian, they're speakings that are situated in political conditions that make that both a kind of ecstatic speaking and a painful speaking and disturb the relationships that existed before in my life, before those enunciative moments. The piece that I made for Commonwealth sits in a series of works called ricerche, which in Italian means research. And I use that Italian word because the pieces are stepping off of a piece of film, 1963 film by Pier Paolo Pasolini called Commisi d'amore. And in Commisi d'amore, Pasolini essentially goes out into and across Italy, interviewing people about sex and sexuality, but also kind of getting to questions of economics and politics. And what was most fascinating to me about his film is the way in which he interviews people individually. So he'll address a question to them individually, but also as they're held in groups of neighbors, groups of an army troop, a football, soccer team, co-workers, activists, students. So in 2013, I embarked on a series of works, of which the piece in Richmond is the 3rd. This is the first Ricerche 3, in which I sort of tease out and expand to try to deal with the ways in which sex and sexuality are symptoms in the US political sphere, particularly the way we talk about or think about politics. The Ricerche 3 was an expanded interview with 35 students at an all-women's college in Massachusetts, although not all of them identify as a woman. So also the enunciative moment as a moment to break a kind of categorization, even and to expel or to kind of complicate the labels and terminologies and categorization we have. The second of these was a piece called Ricerche 1, in which I interviewed kids of LGBTQ families with a kind of foundational question that Pasolini uses in his film. I just took it from his film, which is, how are babies born? I interviewed groups of 5 to 8-year-olds and then also groups of 17 to 18-year-olds. And in that, a lot of it became about how one narrates a kind of origin story, how one narrates their position inside of a family and carves out that distinction between themselves and a kind of the narrative of their family. And so participating in Commonwealth really allowed me to then dig into a third component of this series, which is Ricerche 2. And what the piece was shot across one morning, really, 3 passes of an interview. And in the interview, I'm asking the players questions that have to do with their relationship to tackle football, how they came to it, what they like about it, what they enjoy about it. And those things are also constantly bleeding to other territories outside of football. So for me, one of the things that is important is the ways in which that group of 23 players sits inside of a team. And that team is a collectivity. We have many ways, I think, at this given moment to understand sports teams as held by political conditions. But beyond those, I'm also interested in the ways in which even just to say, I play tackle football, is an enunciation held by politics and inside of politics. And that I'm interested in that way in which we speak ourselves both in collective affiliation and identification, and sometimes also collective disidentification, and the importance of these spheres of talking, speaking, to also the other ways that we live our relations, touching, being near, acting with, etc. So thank you very much. And I think we next go on to Monica Rodriguez, and I'm just gonna stop sharing.
Hello. Hi, I'm Monica Rodriguez. I'm an artist from Puerto Rico, and I'm currently living in Los Angeles, California. The project that I'm presenting for Commonwealth is titled Las Antillas para los Antillanos. If we could go to the slides. Okay. Yeah, so this project I started in 2016, and it's a long-term project that takes different forms. It's been taken the form of a kind of archive where I ask different artists from the different islands in the Caribbean region to submit an idea, an image or a text or anything related to this idea of the Antilles for the Antillians, which is, sorry, the title of the project translated to in English is The Antilles for the Antillians, and it's a phrase from a Puerto Rican thinker, Ramon Emeterio Betances, who in the late 19th century said this phrase as a way to fight colonialism in the Caribbean, and especially against Spanish colonialism, and in the islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. So for Commonwealth, what I proposed was to do look at monuments throughout these islands in the Caribbean that are monuments to independence in the islands. And then if we can move the slides. Yeah, so I don't know if you can see very well, but it's 12 monuments. The monuments are a monument for Betances, and in Puerto Rico, there's 3 monuments per island. So from Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Puerto Rico. Oh my God, sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, so it's 12 monuments about the independence movement, about independence in the islands. And underneath the monuments, there's a quote from Betances, which is a quote that he wrote in a letter in the 1800s. Which says, in English, it says, "Today the revolution proceeds like a volcanic eruption from the social strata that forms the very core of the people." So this phrase, I was very interested in it in relation to the images of the monuments, because it has this this connotation of nature and the idea of the volcano. And like, for me, it seemed like the idea of the silent volcano and then when it erupts. And in relation to the monuments, was thinking about how the idea of independence that is present, no, in the islands through these monuments, and how it's just there. Okay, next slide. Yeah. So these are examples of some of the monuments. The one to the left is the monument to El General Gregorio Luperón, which is in the Dominican Republic. Luperón was a military general who was the leader in the restoration of the Dominican Republic in 1863, which was a war for the independence of Spain. The second monument is called Jose Marti Memorial, located in the Plaza de la Revolución in Cuba. Marti was an important philosopher and political theorist, and a symbol of the Cuban independence from Spain. Next slide. Then the next one is a monumento to Betances in Lares, Puerto Rico, and it's located in the Plaza de la Revolución in Lares, which commemorates the Grito de Lares, which was one of the first revolutions against Spanish colonialism in Puerto Rico, which was also, it happened today on the 23rd of September of 1868. And then the last monument there is the Constitution Monument in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and it's commemorating the Constitution of 1801 that was established by Toussaint. Okay, thank you. So now we'll go to Paul.
Hello. Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much to the ICA, to Philadelphia Contemporary, to Beto Local for this event, and of course to just be a part of it is, is immense. I have immense gratitude. We are in the midst of one of the most important and exhilarating times of reckoning when it comes to monuments, and we're also in a moment that's quite terrifying. I'm going to share my screen for you here. We have seen over the summer, in the midst of uprisings against systemic racism and police brutality and state violence, the ways in which people have pushed the status quo around monuments. And here, an image that you see that's really blew me away, taken by Air VA drone above Monument Avenue in Richmond. I've had the opportunity to be in Richmond several times this summer to kind of see and listen and learn, and to see a monument that is in process of being inscribed upon with layers that really remind us as this is a site to reckon with centuries of violence and subjugation. But I'm also thinking, of course, today is a day that the killers of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, were not charged, and just reminding of this moment that not just the enduring cycles of history, but the other side, the kind of collision course, which is that due to executive orders and certain kind of decree on local and state levels, that the ability to push upon, to inscribe upon, to even try to challenge monumental history is being criminalized and being threatened. And so we have this collision course of history between what is powerfully happening around the country, and not just by those seeking to topple monuments, but also local government that has been working over the last several years, and especially this summer, to remove symbols of white supremacy, and what that means and how that's happening in a moment of broader challenges, reckoning, and unprecedented, in many ways, democratic challenges. I want to talk about Monument Lab, our work, the project, the studio that I co-founded with Ken Lum and a team of curators, artists, researchers. And Monument Lab began in a classroom in 2012. We're now a public art and history studio. We have a fellows program I'll talk about in a moment, a podcast. We do projects around the country and increasingly around the continent. And that work has, really sustained, inspired, and pushed us by meeting people in public spaces, working with artists, interfacing with city and local government to really think about the past, present, and future of monuments together. For us, the monument is, of course, as we define it, a statement of power and presence in public. We came up with that definition to account for traditional weighty monuments, bronze and marble, but also recognize how poetry, political acts, gathering in public also is seen as monumental. And if you have the time, the money, and the power to build a monument that's important to you in bronze or marble under the mantle of permanent, you do. But if you don't have the time, the money, and power, you gather next to a monument that exists to amplify your voice. Our first project that we did with the late artist Terry Adkins and a team at the Philadelphia City Hall in 2015 premised around the idea of a question. We asked a question to as many people as we could in our city: what is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? And the artist Terry Adkins at that time said it was an empty classroom. He wanted to note that Philadelphia was known for educational history, but at that time also for school closures and budget cuts, disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. And so he said right in the middle of City Hall, he wanted to build a monument. It was not permanent, it was not universal, shattering that kind of sense even at that time, but he wanted it to be both critical and inviting. And it was meant to be a space of reinvention and reimagining. Adjacent to that monument was a different kind of classroom. It was a learning lab. We hired our students, we hired a public historian and a social worker, and we gathered various kinds of speech. And I think that's something I just want to put out there, that whenever we work with artists, whenever we work with members of the public, no matter the spectacle of monument, we're looking for the way that speech operates on, around these public sites as well. At this lab, we collected monument proposals, people who could answer that central question. And the first time we did this, 35,000 people came in 3.5 weeks. Close to 500 left monument proposals. Reading them is like reading the most haunting, beautiful, tragic story about the city. We did not seek things that were feasible or practical, but we wanted people to speak to the values and visions of the city. This project in 2015, as a prototype in of itself, spawned a citywide exhibition in 2017. I'll show you a few samples of it now, and thinking about how the artists that we worked with, 20, across the city, integrated both the image and acts of speech into their work. Here, the artist Mel Chin's project To Me was a series of identical pedestals, modeled after one outside of City Hall. You can see it here from above, which included 90 feet of ADA accessible ramp snaking behind each of the pedestals. And what Mel wanted to do is make a monument to Philadelphia as the home of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that balance between the me and the we, and really think about that transition, what it means that anyone could be rising to monumental status, but someone else could be at the monument next to you, be also a monument, or you could share your pedestal, and how did this collectivity and individuality get balanced? The artist Tanya Bruguera proposed a fairly traditional monument in one sense that was raised and figural, but Tanya wanted to make it out of unfired clay. So over time it would fall apart. And this was in the spirit of her project, a monument to new immigrants, as she said. She wanted to distinguish between legacy immigrant groups, often who of European descent, who ushered into whiteness and upon their arrival in Philadelphia and other places in America, and think about, in this case, a monument that was meant to disappear. And part of the kind of poetry of this piece, not only was that Tanya asked us once the monument would fall apart to replace it with another one that we had waiting, but also included the plaque underneath in memory of all the new immigrants who have the strength to start over and give so much to others. This balance between presence and absence was incredibly important to the artists. Michelle Angela Ortiz made a monument to mothers detained at an immigrant family prison outside of Philadelphia, and worked with the shutdown Burke's Coalition to campaign. She did this project in a number of ways, but one of the ways she did this was bringing coffee filters into Burke's Detention Center and out to create paper flowers that people could write messages on. And thinking about this on a grander scale, she placed this outside of City Hall on a day that Governor Tom Wolf was present. And a part of this campaign to think about the small, finite nature, the details, the stories of mothers and families who were detained, and how to put this on a bigger stage. And again, I just note this was 2017. And of course, we heard from artist Sharon Hayes, and Sharon Hayes's work in Monument Lab 2017 was profound. If they should ask, a monument to the absence of women honored in Philadelphia's public spaces, in a city that boasts well over 1,000 statues and monuments to historic figures. There are only 2 that are to women who actually lived, including Joan of Arc, who's not a famous Philadelphian, and Mary Dyer, who is a Bostonian Quaker woman. And this project, this collection and recreation of pedestals from around the city of Philadelphia, scaled to a half size, as Sharon has noted, made these more human-sized and people approached. I think also, as you went up to it, not only would you see the names of women who could have been or still could be honored with monuments, there were all these moments of interchange, both in the making of the sculpture with an intersectional, intergenerational group of women, trans-inclusive activists, but also moments that activated the sculpture itself. And here an image of a friend of the project, Aaron Wilson, who actually now is one of the political directors of the Biden and Harris campaign. Of course, going alongside all of these projects were our labs, where we paid high school students and local artist educators and worked with our college students to collect monument proposals. And I want to just get to the end of this real quick, but just to say that this idea, this back and forth, this place of dialogue and discourse, of collecting monument proposals, was incredibly important to the way that we work. We build prototype monuments. We aim to build participatory forms of data. And all of it is to just remind us that monuments are not meant to be static. Monuments are not meant to be above us and speak without us. Monuments are meant to change. Monuments are meant to be layered spaces. Out of this project, we created a report to the city and have since then worked with a number of institutions and municipalities around the country and continent to produce more data, to know not just what monuments exist, but how they're there and what our relationships to them. And I close just on this note, that part of the work that Monument Lab includes and works on now is through our Fellows program that works with people who have been doing the work around the country, around the continent and beyond, who push the idea of what a monument is, what a monument could be. As we're thinking about Richmond, I want to make sure to note and honor a member of our first Monument Lab Fellows cohort, Free Agunfemi Bangura, who here is depicted in a most recent event, Praise the Living, Raise the Dead, in Shako Bottom. And just thinking about when we think what a monument is, how symbol and text, conversation, and reflection all work together, and that work continues. Thank you. And next up, Brian Palmer.
So I want to start with this image, July 8th, 2020. First, actually, before that, I want to thank Paul and Sharon and Monica and Nelson for showing us alternatives to the hegemonic and toxic structures that we have been contending with. There's something really hopeful about seeing work, artistic work, artwork, installation, sculpture that connects with the lived environment of the people who actually live there. That to me is extremely powerful. My role, or the role that I'm going to try and fill, as someone who was on the ground during the uprisings and topplings here in Richmond from May until now. So this is, as I said, July 8th, 2020. This is the top prefab piece of the Confederate soldiers and sailors monument being unceremoniously hauled away. Y'all know that this was not the smoothest transition, shall we say, from a monument full to a monument, not less, but let's do LESS, a city with fewer monuments. This is actually quite a lovely photograph that I took of Richmond Police and Virginia State Police massed on Broad Street on May 31st. Lovely picture, not a lovely outcome. This was where officers attacked peaceful protesters. And I can say that as someone who was there and who got pepper sprayed in the face for the first time. There were conversations between officials and protesters. This was a city hall press conference that actually the Mayor Stoney, there's my cursor, you can see I'm pointing out, Mayor LeVar Stoney, Mayor of Richmond. He had called the press conference, but the protesters, BLM and all sorts of other folks assembled, and essentially they directed the flow of the event. One of the key places that folks who live in Richmond or who have visited Richmond will know that the Robert E. Lee statue and Lee Circle were a point of contention, and now they are, in fact, what many of us consider to be a liberated space. So it's no longer Lee Circle, but it's Marcus David Peters Circle. Marcus David Peters, y'all may remember, an African-American man who was killed by police as he was having a mental health crisis in 2018. I linger on this image because I've had some conversations with people. I have a lot of conversations with monument defenders and supporters. The first word that comes to mind when I speak to them is this is vandalism, violence, and defacement. And I encourage them to think about the context in which these actions occurred. This relentless tagging, which is really quite phenomenal. I don't think anyone was surprised that on May 30, May 31st, these monuments, the Confederate monuments across the city of Richmond, became targets for the ire of protesters who were demonstrating against the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. What I think struck people was the intensity of that assault on these monuments. So I've encouraged people to look at this as a kind of a refacement. So Paul talked about the reinscribing, but I'm juxtaposing defacement with refacement because the words, nasty words up there, but the actions that embedded these statues in our environment were absolutely violent and anti-democratic. So this family, the Robinson family, is posing here. The two younger daughters are taking a picture of their parents and their little baby sister seated on the base of the Robert E. Lee Monument, which was dedicated in 1890. They used a fair amount of public funding. John Mitchell Jr., anybody who knows who John Mitchell Jr. is, the editor of the Richmond Planet, which was the most really militant African-American newspaper at the turn of the century. Mitchell himself was born enslaved. Mitchell was on city council, and he did not vote to invest public money in this monument. So that was a form of African-American resistance when such resistance would get you lynched. And you can't understand anything about the monuments. You can't speak knowledgeably about what should happen to the monuments if you don't understand that history, if you don't understand that there was a systematic, not simply disenfranchisement, but dehumanization and stripping of rights that African Americans had won in the Civil War and during Reconstruction. 1884, 1894, 1902 Constitution, 90% of African men disenfranchised. And during the period in those first years of the 1900s, African Americans wiped away, wiped out of, thrown out of legislatures, city councils, such that this wave of monument erection happened at the precise time that white supremacy was clawing its way back to power. And I think we have to remember that these monuments went up in an anti-democratic environment. That should affect our political speech about monuments now. So that is a problem. The problem that I am working on is that if you're just pulling down monuments because they are signs of white supremacy, that's not enough. First of all, you have to think about what's going to go in their place. But second of all, you have to understand what was happening as those monuments were going up, the stripping away of political rights and the amassing of political power by white elites, such that African American communities were starved, reduced to penury. People's opportunities were limited. People were driven to other places. So this is my final picture. This is East End Cemetery. It's historic African American cemetery founded in 1897. It's where I've been volunteering. My wife has been volunteering. Members of the Friends of East End have been volunteering because there's been no government investment. So think about that for a second. Confederate cemeteries, public and private, have been getting public state money in huge amounts in the aggregate since 1902, and even before that, on an ad hoc basis. It adds up to about $9 million. These sites, they only started getting state money in about 2017, 2018, and that money is generally, at least in the city of Richmond, going to the wrong people. It's not going to the people who are actually restoring the cemeteries. So we're basically repeating Jim Crow light. If you don't understand the history, then you can't really plot a better future. So my goal is for people to understand Jim Crow, the afterlife of Jim Crow, so that we can make better decisions, so we can have a more informed populace, and so we can talk about what Paul was referring to, this crisis in our democracy now, in which we have ideology over the empirical. And in our public discourse, I think that is what's killing us. And maybe I'll just leave it there. Thank you. I'm going to unshare now.
So I invite all the speakers to come back. So thanks so much for all of your presentations. I mean, really. There's so many different kind of networking sets of connections, I think, in a lot of things that you all were talking about. And one of the things that I was wondering that any of you might have some thoughts on is just thinking a little bit about if we were to think of like speech and images, like if we were to consider a monument to be an image, one of the things that is often at stake when we talk about speech or images is the ways in which they do or don't have power, right? The questions of whether or not they can sort of enact real action in the world. And I'm wondering, that there's so many ways that that each of you spoke to the consequences of either speech or images. And I'm wondering if any of you can speak to the ways in which you've either thought about this or addressed this in your practice, sort of how speech has direct, real consequences.
Well, just in the context of the Richmond monuments, speech was used at dedications, in newspapers, across society to essentially establish their power, amplify their power, echo their power. So at the dedication of the cornerstone for the Jefferson Davis monuments, Bradley Johnson, a former Confederate general, gave a speech, and his assertion in that speech was the Emancipation Proclamation was the worst thing to ever happen to the Negro. So all of that speech, that verbal speech, the speech in the newspapers, the lost cause ideology at which which radiated from these monuments, they were terribly self-reinforcing and destructive. And I think those stories obviously buttressed political power. Because if the lost cause was so marvelous, if the lost cause says that the Emancipation Proclamation was the worst thing to happen to Negroes, slavery was a good thing, it had a Christianizing influence, why do they need to vote? So those images, those actual structures kind of became extensions of that entire worldview. And I think that's why we talk about these monuments as being these structures of oppression. People talk about how they offend Black people. They don't offend me as a Black person, they offend me as a citizen, because they are lies made whole.
Yeah, I just want to first of all say thank you and echo and just, you know, appreciate that comment. And I think that there's a few layers to think about here. One, of course, is that dedication speech is often some kind of insight that you can see the broader aims, while the monument is supposed to stand silently or speak for itself. The dedication speeches are part of historical record. If you watch just last week, the city of Charlottesville removed at Ready, a Confederate soldier outside of their courthouse, you know, also a site of various layers of state and racial violence from all around it. And online, because you were kind of prohibited from being there, though a lot of folks were on the scene. You know, I saw one of our fellows, Zy Bryant, who's been a leading voice in Charlottesville there. But they read the dedication speech that was published in the local newspaper. And it was what you saw as the stream online. And it was just this remarkable moment. And I think for those of us who were in that midst of the critical work, pulling that out and finding when is it an appropriate time to push ourselves to read that and make that public, and what are other times where we don't want to hear any more from those voices, because they didn't just need the speech to be out there, right? There are times we actually need to hear from activists and artists and make room for them, right? And that's a little bit of the ambivalence. But I also just want to bring up several points that are kind of more rhetorical. One, the scholar Mabel Wilson, recently we were in an event together, and she said, I don't call them Confederate monuments, I call them American monuments, because they were built in a time of the United States of America, not during the Civil War. And so I think it reminded me of another point brought up several times, which is, why do we call them monuments? If they're paid for privately, pressured into public, what qualifies it as a monument? It kind of reifies its own power. So I think these are important things to ask ourselves, and why I'm very drawn to artist projects who take the claim, who take the power, who kind of like symbolically plug into an existing monument as a way to amp up what they do, or they push us away from the pedestal to see what else and who else is out there.
I was wondering maybe to think a little bit about how political speech can become monumentalized by being kind of recorded or reperformed or reproduced in some way. I'm thinking specifically of Nelson and Monica's use of these quotations of Betances and Abizo, that they're ways that you're sort of reproducing something to some degree that is speech. It isn't something that has a kind of materiality. So I'm just wondering, like, how you were thinking about, like, what is the function of reproducing the speech?
Well, for me, with my project is taking Betances' phrase, the Antilles for the Antillians, literally as the title of the project, but also as like basically the idea, the basis of the project, which is the formation, at the end, the formation of a Caribbean Federation, right? To fight for the islands to come together for their Commonwealth and against colonialism in the region. And taking that speech or that phrase as the content to then see how to create new forms with it that kind of like talk about that idea. So, for example, like asking other artists to present what if, like, this idea of the federation, how do you imagine that? And then submitting an image about that, or collecting texts from Caribbean writers that talk about Caribbean experience and reading them out loud in group sessions, and here as like the idea of independence, right? And then what happens after that, and how these monuments are like a reminder of that idea, but then also a reminder of like the neocolonial policies that have happened in the Caribbean, and how that idea also is kind of like we're still struggling and fighting for it in a way, especially with Puerto Rico and its relationship to the U.S. That it's like something that has never been able to come to fruition, and it's still, if we think about the idea of independence for Puerto Rico, like what does that even mean, right? Like what kind of independence do we want, or do we think should be?
And Nelson, for you?
Yes, Brian just spoke about history, using history to plot a better future. I think that's what you said. And to me, using Albizu's speeches is a way of doing that. Above all, because those speeches are forbidden. You still cannot say those things. You won't be thrown in jail, but you won't, you won't be looked upon as a good person. So in a way, I love to use that history. First of all, because we have to learn about it. We are not taught about any of those things. And secondly, if we're gonna move from where we are and we're really stuck in this colonial situation, we have to know what happened before. How did we got there? How do we ever get where we are? So in a way, that would be to me my sense of moving forward. I've been thinking about this thing about toppling monuments, and in Puerto Rico it just doesn't. I don't think it works the same, because our monuments, in a way, even if they're monuments to people that we don't like Columbus, they're there, and I look at them and say, we have a history. Even if it's terrible, but we do have a history. If they weren't there, we wouldn't even have anything, because as it is, we have nothing. We're not supposed to have a history. We're not supposed to be people. We're just subjects. So I don't see myself toppling them. I see myself changing them, but not really toppling them. In a way, I think Monica is doing that. That's her program, to show all those monuments, and I'm very interested about that, because I hadn't realized that all of the islands and the countries in this region, we have those monuments, so we don't even look at them.
I would argue that toppling monuments doesn't do anything but topple monuments. So if you don't understand why you're toppling the monuments, or you have a very simplistic understanding, it really doesn't amount to much. And that was sort of the part of the point I was trying to make, that you need to understand the history beneath it, and particularly in this case, it is the devastating impact of Jim Crow and its afterlife, which isn't just in cemeteries, but it's in redlining, it's in police brutality, it's in all of these things, which is why, you know, we have toppled monuments, and we had a brutal police response afterwards. So it was like there was a complete disconnect, you know, where people protesting police brutality, and Richmond police and Virginia State Police are pepper spraying people in the face. And some people are making the connections, but there's this kind of vacuum now, because I think people don't understand the true weight of this history, that it just wasn't about these false ideological statements, but it's how they got there, understanding that process, and understanding that the process is very, very similar now.
Yeah, I think that connection between symbols and systems is incredibly important to look at and to see how they're playing out in real time. You know, I think I am kind of fascinated by the word topple for a number of reasons. And it's something that just is on my mind is that it seems like it's in one sense like the operating way that we understand what's happening to monuments. And then I also think about of the monuments that have been removed or slated for removal across the country, the large majority, like upwards of over 90%, are not by people pulling them down, but by local ordinances. And I don't want to, I want to be cautious of like, does the local ordinance actually get at what Brian, you're talking about, is like really tending to the roots of white supremacy and systemic violence that goes underneath the monuments. But I do think it's fascinating, the kind of threat of history disappearing is in large part happening in local government contexts. And what does that mean to then see other moments of other layering or even the kind of physical toppling?
Well, that makes sense. And I think if it's because it's local governance doing it, that it has meaning when there's a robust public conversation about why these things are going. That's where the change is. So the change comes not with knocking down a monument. The change comes with the changing of standards of learning in schools and the preservation of a Marcus David Peters circle in some form that is refaced. So yes, I mean, I agree, and I understand that much of the toppling isn't citizen motivated, but regardless of who's doing the toppling or the refacement, there's got to be some substantive discussion. And I guess people talk about lifting up of the actual history, both the hardness and the resistance and the resilience.
Yeah, one of the things I guess I was gonna throw into the conversation that became very stark to me when I was working on the monument, the absence of monuments to women, is that when you posed the first question, Noah, about you know, in what ways does speech have consequences, real material consequences? It's also really important to look at, I think, the ways in which the repression of speech, so the silence or the absence of narrative or the absence of certain histories, certain speakings, certain enunciations, has also very deep and real material consequences. And one of the things I found as I was looking at, okay, one of the questions of like, well, why are there no monuments or very few monuments to women who actually lived, who contributed to the life and the lives of the city of Philadelphia? You look at like a history repressed, not just once, but repressed again and again and again, so that as it's pulled out, it is, you know, forcibly buried or erased or silenced again. And I think that is a big component of both what Brian and Nelson are addressing.
Yeah, I was thinking specifically, maybe as a point of transition also, of some other different works of yours than the work in the exhibition that also in some ways are reperformances of kind of historical activism or historical utterances that that are political, and the ways in which you know, it's sort of like giving visibility or giving a space for something that may be a history that's not as preserved. And there's this question that came in that's a very kind of basic question from the audience, like asking if the interviewees were prepped beforehand, you know, presented with a list of questions, or was it all authentic or presented at the exact moment? And I was thinking about this when you were talking about, in your presentation, the moment of enunciation, something that could be ecstatic and painful, that actually is a political gesture in and of itself, but also it's sort of making meaning of that moment, you know, making meaning of that contemporary moment. And so I was thinking about this question that's like, I think it would be great for you to answer, but also just to think about like why you would choose to have them be prepped or not prepped, like to, you know, some notion of sort of authenticity versus artifice.
Yeah, it's a great question, and because it also allows me to say that I guess my relationship to authenticity in a way, like one of the things when I grounded my own relationship to political speech in these enunciations I made in my early 20s, they would be different than I would make now. And that access to change, maybe it relates to the second question in the chat too, the access to a futurity, and to a futurity that is fluid and dynamic and sometimes lusciously contradictory is important. So yeah, concretely, I did prep them in that I didn't want them to be surprised. I wanted them to be able to have as much information as they needed to make, to consent, to say, yeah, I want to do this. So I told them the sphere of questions I would ask. I told them it's coming from the Pasolini. They can look at it if they want. It's coming in relation to these other works of mine. They can look at those if they want. But I didn't give them a list of questions. And I really importantly through this process have learned, if you ask someone a question once on camera, it's very hard for them to answer it again on camera. So in that way I didn't want them to be tricked in any way, but I also wanted us all to have access to a spontaneous question. And I think of that as a bit different than an authentic, a spontaneous conversation. And I think of that as a bit different than an authentic conversation. They're in charge of their own authenticity, and whether they provided me with a fake self or a real self was their decision. And in a way, I think they provided me with a self that is held in their teamness and in relation to each other. And I want, you know, so I was interested in all of those dynamics. And in that way, didn't give them an exact list of questions.
Just a quick follow-up on that is, Nelson, in your piece, one of the aspects of the score is that the people who are, the performers who are reading these speeches that are in their original Spanish must be non-native Spanish speakers. So can you speak a little bit, I'm just thinking again about sort of the performer and their relationship to the understanding of the thing that is performed. And how you were thinking about that as a choice.
Well, I think those, if you've read the, I don't know if you read Spanish, but if you've read those speeches, they're very hard. That's exactly what the police jotted down when they were listening to Albizu in those places where they were following him. And to me, if you know exactly what it says, it's hard to, I would imagine that it would be hard to say those things. So I prefer people who don't really, who may not understand what they're saying, because they would concentrate on how it sounds. And that brings that piece into the realm of music, which I was very much interested in. And the same goes for the accents and mistakes made when pronouncing certain words or putting the accent in the wrong syllable, that kind of thing, which forces you to prick up your ear because it sounds unfamiliar. And I'm very much interested in that unfamiliarity. it gives those speeches another sense, which is not just the forbidden political speech, but also the beauty of saying those things in amplified in a public space, where they were actually said in the very beginning. I mean, those all were public speeches, and now they're public again. But they have a twist, which I find, I will use the word, I find it charming. So, and I think in political speech, we also need that beauty.
Okay, so I'm putting together two questions that came from the audience. One is, given that all speech has consequences, can any of the panelists speak to the role of museums in this discourse? Do museums play a role in how these issues and struggles are monumentalized? And someone else gave an example of Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War being installed as an artwork in Richmond, very close to Monument Avenue, that's directly in dialogue with those monuments. So it's a museum intervening in some way into the discourse.
I can say one thing maybe, and it may be that other of the panelists can take up museums more particularly, because I hear the pointedness in that, and that's really important to consider, because museums both sort of allow for, kind of give artists a space of permission to sometimes say something unacceptable in other conditions, and yet they also bind it. So maybe others will take that up specifically. I guess tangentially to that, or related to that, I wanted to say that one of the things I found really interesting about being invited to do a piece for Monument Lab is that I really specifically didn't want to make a public artwork, and I can try to describe what I think that was in my head at that moment, but I wasn't invited to make a monument. So what I took it to be is a temporary monument. And to make a temporary monument, given the permission from this initiative, allowed me to put out an object that would never otherwise be able to exist, that would never be accepted by the city to sit in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia and be seen by a stranger public that kind of came across it. So in some ways, I do think there are little zones of possibility that arts initiatives, and in that sense, museums can carve out then for us as artists. And that was one specific instance where that happened.
May I add that we cannot expect purity in all these processes. I think we have to deal with museums exist, and that's the way, like Sharon said, we're allowed to say some things in museums that we're not allowed to say outside them. But if we don't work with that, we're really hiding ourselves. So to me, that's not a problem. I can deal with there's no purity in it. So you have to dirty your hands anyway. So you might as well do it better, in a better way.
I think this relates a little bit to another question that came in that I think is kind of implied by some of the things that Sharon was saying, which is that history is a theme in a lot of this work. But the question is, can artwork in relationship to these ideas have some relationship to the future or futurity, or making a connection to envision something or to speculate on something that is different than now? So that's different than thinking about monuments, monumentalizing, either resisting, refusing, condemning the past, commenting on the contemporary moment, but sort of envisioning something in the future.
I don't know if this answers the question, but it's in a way kind of also responding to the previous line of thought. Just kind of two notes. I mean, one, I often think, like, when people say, like, is a monument successful? it's such a great question to ask students in a class, because there actually is no one criteria. Oftentimes it's over time how the monument signifies. It's that really matters. And for me, I try to hold that thought. I have to say, I saw the Kehinde Wiley Rumors of War in Times Square. And I had read about it for a long time. But it wasn't until coming to Richmond to see it for myself that I had a different understanding. And I think while the messaging had a lot to do with Monument Avenue, it's not officially part of that long corridor, right? It's off of Arthur Ashe Boulevard. It's the proximity, and this is a product of when I saw it, so it's just more of a personal reflection. I saw it in the first time July 2nd. So it was the day after the state of Virginia changed the local, signed into law the idea that local municipalities could take into their own hands the handling of Confederate monuments. And of course, is several weeks after the May and June uprisings, in which the United Daughters of Confederacy headquarters was burned and tagged. And so I went and saw at sunset Rumors of War, really just a few feet away from not just the United Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters, but the multiracial security guards setting up shop and taking over for the night. And it was a kind of quiet moment. It wasn't loud, but there's something going on there that I think is for me, drew me out more than the story of Monument Avenue, which is the United Daughters of the Confederacy are, not just the promoters of the lost cause, but the fundraisers of it. Not just the builders of monuments, but the builders of memorial days and school names and policy. And just thinking about, to me, that's the kind of interesting counterpoint between what are we doing now versus what have we inherited? What kind of generational change can we make? I think to the point about museums, I'm struck by what museums can do and what museums can't do, and it's hard to generalize, but I think one of the most powerful forms of generalizing is also a form of statement, of rhetoric, is the hashtag museums are not neutral, which was really sparked by Latanya S. Autry and Mike Murowski, and has been shared across the world 1 million times online. And you can spot another person, an adherent of the Museums Are Not Neutral movement, by the t-shirts that they wear that are available online, and always are fundraisers, including for museum workers who have disproportionately been laid off from education and outreach departments, which are more inclusive of more racial and ethnic diversity. So there's just something going on here that I'd say, like, when we think about what a museum is, whether it's a distillation of the past or a future-making site, is to just remind ourselves that it's not neutral, and that people make decisions based on both what they promote and what they exhibit and what they curate, and also what they resource. And more attention to that, I feel like, gets at some things Brian was talking to as well. It's not enough to just take away a monument. It's about the programs and the thoughts and the structures that also are part of symbolic and artistic forms of expression.
What I also love about that question about history, I love the question about history, and yes, 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 yes. And I love that the question, so if the history changes, because it really, the question puts on the head or nose or whatever, the issue that history is also not stable, that we think of it as, okay, that thing that happened. But I think what Brian is talking about, so what Brian talked about in his presentation so well, is that these are contests and conflicts, and that those conflicts existed, like that conflict was existing at the moment of the sort of erecting of those monuments, and it persists now, and it is not, these are kind of evolving and changing, and the conflict is inhabited by new folks and new perspectives and new understandings and new speculations that I think, you have to speculate towards history, as many really amazing historian and other writers have spoken of in terms of the gaps of an archive. You have to speculate historically, and we are speculating in a future sense.
There's something that Paul was talking about earlier that relates a little bit to this next question, which was to say, I'd be curious to hear the panel's thoughts about the argument that some recent public gestures enacted by local municipal governments, such as the phrase Black Lives Matter being painted on the streets in Washington, D.C., can be a way for governments to enact alignment with the goals of protesters and activists while abstaining from doing the work of dismantling systemic structural racism. I thought of that also in relationship to like the Black Square in Instagram that sort of occurred over the summer, and various pronouncements that had come from museums, also to speak to the museum's role in all of this. But I wonder, I think it's a great question because it also is this kind of like enunciation of language in physical space that is done in a civic space and sometimes written by public governments. What do you guys think about its power?
Someone's got to hit that buzzer, ding, ding, ding. Well, so I would say each situation is different, but deploying rhetoric into a space, spoken or written, is just that. So I think I would have to look at the deployers. You know, what is the government of DC doing to deal with structural racism in its city? I don't know enough about DC politics anymore to know whether this is just a rhetorical thing or whether it's one finger in a larger fist of actual systemic work. But in terms of whether that sort of stuff makes any particular change, and I don't mean to write it off, because obviously if you're going to paint something in front of the White House, it's going to have an effect. But in terms of systemic change, I don't see that if it's divorced from anything else.
You know, I think the case in DC is fascinating in a number of ways, because of course it's in this latest round, the first that sparked this happening across the country. There are other precedents of kind of street writing. I showed the work of Michelle Angela Ortiz, but in 2015, she worked with Juntos in Philadelphia to paint a message outside of the ICE facility as a kind of plea. And I think it's really important if we think about the drone as fundamentally a part of all of these conversations of how we're seeing political speech happening. And I'd love to hear Brian's thoughts on that as a photographer as well. I think in DC, part of the story, of course, is that the 16th Street, which is now Black Lives Matter Plaza, intersects with Lafayette Square. And the mayor of DC, Muriel Bowser, who was a Black woman mayor, kind of worked in order to push out this message, which is massive. It takes 3 city blocks. And, I think walking it, you just get this totality, and you can really see, speaking of writing, the nearby headquarters and buildings who are in solidarity and who are not. The AFL-CIO, St. John's Church, have messages that echo, and I can't remember the name of the famous hotel right on the corner. I think it's the Willard Hotel, and the Ronald Reagan, I think it's an archive. Like, they just have abstract symbols outside. Like, if there's graffiti, they look all like abstract shapes. So there's this conversation echoing all around. But activists, Black Lives Matter activists in DC, who had pointed out that the mayor had thwarted their work, put a defund the police ground mural right next to Black Lives Matter, and it was paved over for reasons that were, it had nothing to do with the message. But it was one step closer to the White House. So, we had a student this summer, Charles Athanopoulos, who's based in Pittsburgh, kind of track every utterance, every site, as best as he could, finding dozens and dozens. And there were, he was largely kind of calling attention to this word that keeps coming up, which is performative. And I think for those of us who are artists, like the work we do is performative. And even if it veers into or engages the civic realm, the performative is what we do. At the same time, when there's a mayoral administration who's making funding decisions and whose voices get elevated to those moments, or the response when people ask for freedom, they ask for the end of forms of police brutality systemically, like the response is a mural, is therefore not enough.
So I think maybe we'll close it there. First of all, I just want to thank all of you for your work, for your thoughts, and your conversation with one another. And also for the rest of the audience to know that in the coming publication, not only is the work of the artists of Sharon, of Monica, and Nelson, and the other artists going to be represented in the upcoming publications online, but Brian is also going to have a short piece of writing that's also going to be included that goes a little bit more deeply into some of these issues. So our goal is to have this be an ongoing way of sort of peeling back different layers. So thanks again to all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
And thank you all to the audience for being here as well. Okay, have a good night.